Hi, everyone. We're going to continue on with our discussions here about interest groups, and we're going to be focusing on the area primarily on the iron triangle. So when we look at the iron triangle, this is a great way to consider the overall power of interest groups and also the relationships that interest groups have with congressional committees and bureaucratic agencies. So you can't really read all the interaction that's on these 3 points of the iron triangle, but you can find more information about the iron triangle on pages 451 to 452. Now, the key part is to look at this interaction of these three organizations: legislative committees, interest groups, and bureaucratic agencies. So this is the first of the three that we'll cover. Here in Chapter 11, we're looking at interest groups. With Congress, we'll look at legislative committees in Chapter 12. And then in Chapter 14, we'll cover bureaucratic agencies. But these three work together. So interest groups, for example, may provide contributions, financial contributions, campaign contributions to members of legislative committees. Then legislative committees may turn around and give budget approval to bureaucratic agencies, and then bureaucratic agencies will give those contracts to the interest groups. That's just one way of looking at that interaction. Campaign contributions, budget approval, and then contracts, and the three working together. Be sure and read through pages 451, 452. In some ways, remember this from Chapter 10, we pointed out that in the recent congressional elections, 93% of the incumbents in Congress got reelected. In part, it's because of the iron triangle. So some of the ways of looking at the iron triangle and some real life examples is to look at the defense spending, in particular for the aircraft known as the Osprey. The Osprey is primarily used by the Marine Corps. It is an aircraft that can fly like a plane and also can shift and maneuver to become like and then fly like a helicopter. What has happened over time is that it's continued to improve. In the early stages of the use of the Osprey, it was pretty dangerous and deadly, and many Marines died. I suppose we should say several Marines in crashes. There were some beliefs in the review of this aircraft that it should be scratched. But perhaps one of the reasons why it stayed in existence was the iron triangle. There had already been investments in it, it was in the budget, and there were also then interest groups representing private companies that made the Osprey, and they wanted to continue to get those contracts. And perhaps it was for the best because it does seem to be a pretty good aircraft now. But does the taxpayers, and in this case also the victims, the Marines that died and their families, is it worthwhile for everyone to wait while they continue to improve the aircraft? But it may show us really the power of the iron triangle to keep this aircraft going. We also see that happen in agriculture. So two main ways in which we can see the power of the iron triangle is through defense spending and also in agriculture. And we have subsidies, government spending on farmers to supplement their income. This is done to manage the price of commodities. So to ensure that a price of a particular commodity, wheat, corn, something like that, does not fall, cotton, another really good example, does not fall below a certain market price, the government will buy up the surplus. And so then the price of that commodity continues to stay in a good range. So saying among farmers is it's the only occupation in which you're penalized for having a good year. Maybe that doesn't always work, but in some cases, certainly it does. So should then the practice be for the government to buy up the surplus? So that's, again, seeing these groups work together, agricultural groups and interest groups. And then you have committees in Congress that represent agriculture. And then you would have the Department of Agriculture, and the three working together to support commodities. And that's why corn becomes the nickname of corn is the welfare queen of crops, excuse me. So you look at corn as the welfare queen of crops. It's heavily subsidized, and that really has an impact on our diets. It has an impact on our taxes, and it has an impact on states in which the agriculture there would really focus on this crop. And should we really have that much corn being planted? Is it really just because of the Iron Triangle as one of the reasons why it exists? Well, beyond the Iron Triangles is think about what group of people have the most power within a society. So if we look at competing interest groups, and the argument would be that it would be pluralist. If you look at the two definitions here, and the second one, the pluralist theory, you have competing interest groups that determine political power. And perhaps that is the most effective way. But there is another argument here, as we can see, and that's the elite theory. And a group of wealthy, educated individuals hold most political power. So it's not really among competing groups. It's among just an oligarchy, if you remember from chapter 1. So these are the two competing theories, and determining who within a society, within the American society, who ultimately has the most power. Is it determined in some ways through a democratic process among competing interest groups, or is all that really just a facade? And it's a group of very wealthy, educated individuals who are in some ways behind the political scenes, and they're the ones that are making the decision. You can read about both of these theories and by books that we have actually in our library here at NEO. The Power Elite is a classic, been around now for close to 60 years, written by C. Wright Mills. And this is the book that strongly argues that it's elite theory. It's pretty much all worked out among the elites, where they were, they were born into an elite class, they are educated in an elite class, they get jobs among an elite class, and then they make the decisions to protect the elite class. That's a very brief way of looking at the elite theory. Then we have a book known as the title, Who Governs, by Robert Dahl, and would say that it's always in a state of fluidity, power, and it's shared among these competing interest groups. And it's almost like it's an engine, and those are pistons, and they're moving back and forth, the different groups. And that's what keeps the engine of government going. These competing interest groups to try to persuade the public, try to persuade lawmakers on how to make decisions. And we all have some piece of that action by joining particular interest groups. So this is clearly the pluralist theory, far more democratic in its argument that we all have some opportunity to impact the system. Okay, here we can look at, in your text, a really interesting part of showing the power of interest groups by looking at the ability of interest groups to mobilize public opinion. And you can see that that's done through protest and demonstrations. And both of these first two bullet points, you can see the key is to mobilize membership. You get the active people within your group, you inform them, and you give them opportunity. And so that opportunity may be through protest and demonstrations. Think about the use of social media. You can see how these chapters interact. So we're looking at chapter 7, and the use of social media, now interest groups can contact their members and get them into a particular place, very fast amount of time, get them in front of the cameras and have a protest. And so the key of being effective is how to mobilize membership. And the same thing with grassroots mobilization, mobilize membership. You get the members of an organization on their own to contact lawmakers, contact perhaps key media sites, and that they will now, through emails, through letters, through phone calls, try to persuade lawmakers. So the use there of grassroots mobilization. But there's a third one. It's not really focused in your text, and it's referred to as AstroTurf lobbying. Now, we use the term AstroTurf because it's fake grass. And I don't think AstroTurf's used that much anymore. But in a lot of baseball fields or football fields, they would use AstroTurf, fake grass. And it would appear to be membership mobilization. So it would appear that you have grassroots going on. You've got people within that organization contacting lawmakers, but maybe it's just generated by a computer phone bank, and they're cranking out the phone calls, and they've now clogged up the congressional switchboard, where all the calls are going in, just to say that. And so maybe it attracts some media attention, but it's not really a grassroots activity. It's fake. It's AstroTurf. And some interest groups may engage in that type of activity as well. What your text also pointed out is that you can have interest groups that try to improve the image of an organization. And it could be that interest groups will contact other organizations or other businesses whose job is to improve the image, to improve public image. And I do find this very important because I know some of you perhaps are taking an art class, and maybe you think, where does art fit in our lives? Well, we see it right here. We see the use of institutional advertising. I always find this to be just a brilliant part of institutional advertising. This is from the company British Petroleum. So it's an oil and gas company. British Petroleum, it's one of the biggest ones in the world. It's had some bad experiences, especially some considerable pollution damage on the Gulf of Mexico. But look at its image. It has the color of green and of course the color of yellow, spring colors, rebirth colors, and it doesn't have the name British Petroleum, right? Just the initials BP. And you would think that maybe that's some sort of, I don't know, a business for vegans, as far as you might know, any of us, if we didn't know what BP stood for. And so it's kind of shifting away from the whole idea of what an oil and gas company might be. But then again, I'm sure British Petroleum would say, and why they call themselves BP, they're an energy company, not a petroleum company. And I'm sure that that's accurate. But it's a great way of using symbols. As far as I'm concerned, it's really interesting the way they use art. So here's our question for chat. What is an example of a business or other organization that has used advertising to improve its image? So let's see if we can find some other examples of institutional advertising. An example of a business or other organization that has used advertising to improve its image. Okay, we're going to stop there. So continue to work on that in chat. Looking forward to reading some of your comments there. And now, after this recording and after fall break, we'll be coming back and focusing on Congress.